The oldest marker in the old public graveyard in Carlisle goes back to 1757, just a few years after Carlisle was founded. The name doesn't suggest that prominent figures have their final resting place there, but don't let the plain, anonymous name mislead you. In addition to important citizens from Carlisle, and veterans that go all the way back to the birth of our nation, there's a woman there with a special monument that pays tribute to her bravery.
Molly Pitcher is a fascinating topic because it is one of those stories that mixes fact with legend or myth. She was a woman who would have done what they called follow the drum. She was a camp follower. Her husband, William Hayes, was a member of Proctor's artillery, and on his way to the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, she follows him. She ends up on a battlefield, which would have been extremely rare at the time. What she does on the battlefield, we aren't quite sure of. Where legend says she had been taking pitchers of water to the wounded and the dying, and when her husband gets wounded, she takes over his role and mans a cannon. Modern historians pretty much agree that that's not likely the case, but she was on the battlefield, and we know that through a couple bits of evidence. One, she gets a pension, which would be very rare for a woman. Now, even in the pension paperwork, it says this is for the relief of Molly Pitcher for what she did on the battlefield. They do not go into any detail about what she did on the battlefield. There's also some soldiers' writings. A diary by a man named Joseph Plum Martin. In his published book, Private Yankee Doodle, mentions watching this woman on the battlefield during the battle with cannonballs headed right at her. It's a very interesting take on it.
I wonder how Molly Pitcher's husband felt about her following him onto the battlefield, since it was such a rare occurrence for a female to be on the battlefield.
From all accounts, she was a very tough woman. Local reports have her as she could swear like a trooper, had a fondness for drinking whiskey, and occasionally would chew tobacco. So she was probably tougher than a lot of people might imagine a woman of the late 1700s would have been.
So here we are still talking about her hundreds of years later, and yet I understand her name was invoked during as recently as World War II, which is still 80 years ago, but we still have this consciousness about her, don't we?
Yes, and I would argue that she really becomes a representative of the women's role during the American Revolution. There were many women following the Army. I've seen estimates as high as 25,000 women following the Continental Army doing these vital support roles. Molly Pitcher herself doesn't really even become famous till after the Civil War, when we're trying to kind of reframe the story of America, and a lot of wise people are realizing our women are left out of those stories. And I would argue she becomes a representative of those women.
Earlier, you made the important distinction between establishing what is fact and what is fiction, of course, the legend of Molly Pitcher. And I wonder if there are stories out there that may be very entertaining, but historians find them dubious.
Yes. Even the simple fact of manning a cannon. A cannon crew was many soldiers to operate a cannon efficiently and accurately. One person is not going to be able to step into that role and save the day, as the story would go.
Now, eventually, she collected a pension, that sounds like, from the government then, which legitimizes her involvement, doesn't it?
Yes, and that was after her second husband had passed away, and this was a relief act for her name at the time would have been Mary Macaulay.
And how did her first husband, the one she followed into battle, how did he fare? Did he come out alive?
He comes out alive, but he does pass away soon after the war. They returned to Carlisle, where he was employed as a barber. But then, of course, not a lot is written about hardworking people of the time, so we don't really know how he passes away.
Molly Pitcher is buried in Carlisle, and she has, in the old public graveyard, a pretty formidable monument, and I wonder what forces made that possible. When did that go up, and how much thought was put into the design of the monument? Can you tell us?
The effort for a monument starts around 1876 and will last all the way through World War I. There was a very involved effort to get a very real likeness of Molly Pitcher. And from my understanding and some photos I've seen, they had photos of several generations of the Hayes women. Her birth name would have been Mary Ludwig, as far as we know. When she marries William Hayes, she becomes Mary Hayes. And then she will eventually become Mary Macaulay. And there are descendants from the Hayes family still in this area. And so around the turn of the century, they are compiling these 4 generations of Hayes women photographs. And that is the likeness they come up with Molly Pitcher.
And what kind of significance do you suppose the name Molly Pitcher creates in someone's mind when they hear that name? And obviously it's the impression of a strong female.
Definitely. Even the United States Army has an award for Molly Pitcher. And it goes to the very root of volunteerism for the armed services. And I believe it has to be involved with the artillery school. And so if you do what they deem to be very consequential volunteerism, you can earn a Molly Pitcher Award. We have a portrait from one of our local artists in the 1930s. When I give tours to our local students, it's one of those teaching moments where you can say a lot of what's in this painting is not accurate, with soldiers fighting beside a scalding hot cannon with their shirts off. And it really plays up to the legend aspect of Molly Pitcher.
Let's talk about another prominent person who's buried in the old public graveyard, and that would be General John Armstrong. Who was he?
General John Armstrong would be considered the first citizen of Carlisle. He had many roles over his lifetime. He was deputy surveyor of Cumberland County from its founding in 1750. He lays out the town of Carlisle in 1751 and 52, which actually gives us a kind of a unique architecture, I guess, would be. We don't know if he kind of misunderstood the instructions or just plainly disobeyed them, but he was supposed to lay out a town green in the center of Carlisle. Much like a roundabout in some of our smaller towns would have. Oddly, he laid out an intersection. So the responsibility for having a public green in Carlisle laid on the 2 churches that were built on our square, that they had to reserve their churchyards as a public space as well. He was one of these guys that when anything important was happening, he was there. During the French and Indian wartime period, he is on the Braddock expedition to kick the French out of Fort Duquesne. That ends up in tragedy, but then the kind of second attempt to kick out the French, the Forbes campaign, he is also along with. That one was successful in uprooting the French from western Pennsylvania. Once the Revolutionary War is on the horizon, he is one of Cumberland County's constitutional representatives sent to Philadelphia. When we're forming an army, he becomes a brigadier general in the Continental Army. He was the major general of the Pennsylvania militia. He was a local judge. He had many, many roles in this area.
Let's talk about someone else buried in the old public graveyard, and that would be Frederick Watts. What is his significance?
He's fascinating. He was a lawyer, a judge. He was also an entrepreneur. He was responsible for bringing the Cumberland Valley Railroad through this area. He was the founder of the Carlisle Gas Works to provide lighting. But perhaps where he really becomes notable is in the field of agriculture. He was an experimental farmer, what we might consider like a gentleman farmer. And he is one of these visionaries that realizes that farmers are going to need to upgrade their technology. You're not going to be able to be a successful farmer like your grandfather was.
I wonder what was considered revolutionary agricultural process in those days, trying to get some perspective.
Chemical fertilizers, even just innovations in the machinery itself. Where he really becomes known is with the invention of what's known as the McCormick Reaper. A man named Cyrus McCormick invents this machine that would harvest grain, doing about the work of 5 men. So needing 2 men and a horse to do the work of 5 men. And its first ever testing was here, right outside of Carlisle on Watt's experimental farm known as Creekside. He built it with some really innovative practices. He faced the farmhouse south so that it would have passive solar heating. He had arguably the largest barn in Pennsylvania at the time. He also realized that we needed to set up a system to educate young men in these new ways of farming. And so he advocates for what was known as the Farmers' High School, which will eventually, due to the Morrill Act of 1862, become known as the Pennsylvania State University.
A gourd is a hard-shelled fruit that can be made into a variety of useful objects. Cups, bottles, and birdhouses are just a few. But here are some unusual gourd applications you can add to your wealth of gourd trivia. Like for instance, gourds were used as currency in Haiti in the 1800s. Even today, their unit of currency is called a gourd, spelled with an E at the end. And the next time you see Ricky Ricardo pounding his conga drum in the TV sitcom I Love Lucy, that's right, it was made from a gourd. Here at Meadowbrooke Gourds in Carlisle, they turn gourds into handcrafted decorations.
So a gourd is very much like a pumpkin or squash. It's in the same type of family with them. The difference is, so I say they're cousins kind of, because a pumpkin or squash, when it is past its prime, will just like shrivel up and die. Whereas a hard shell gourd will actually harden over winter, and their skin and the shell of the gourd actually becomes very much like wood.
I picked up one of the raw gourds here in your shop, and I was shocked at how light it was. I expected it to be 3 or 5 pounds, but it was feather light.
It is. Now, if you would go out into the field right now, they're very heavy because they are filled with water, almost like a watermelon. So it takes all winter long for that water and everything inside of the gourd to kind of dry up and absorb. And then as soon as all that drying is finished, we can bring them inside, and they're much lighter. So that is why right now they're actually cutting the gourds off the vine, because we're in fall, so everything has pretty much died away. But we just line them up, because to bring them in now, it would be very heavy for us to bring them in. So we wait until they're completely dry to bring them in, which is normally like February or March when we can get back into the field.
Now, my understanding about a gourd is that it's a hard-shelled fruit. So when I hear the word fruit, it sounds like it's edible, but I'm not convinced.
You do not want to do that. I did do some research, because I get this question a lot. So I did do some research, and in some Indian cultures, they do make teas and soups out of them. They make them out of bottle gourds when they are fresh, but it is.
So there is stuff inside the gourd that can be scooped out and used.
Yeah, there is. It's more or less like the flesh, just like a pumpkin. If you would think about a pumpkin, that's exactly how it is. But it's very, very bitter. And so, in fact, sometimes if you would eat too much of it, it could become fatal. So, and therefore, that's why I think it's bitter, because they don't want people to eat it. So it really has no purpose except for decoration. But now, back in many, many, many years ago with Native Americans, they used them as spoons. They used them as dishes.
So how did you get started here at Meadowbrooke Gourds? It just strikes me as a fairly unorthodox business to be in.
So my brother-in-law is a farmer by trade. He has farmed his entire life. His name is Ben. And so he used to grow everything like tomatoes, green beans, peas, blueberries, strawberries, the whole produce line. He made a trip to New England and brought back what some people would know what a gooseneck gourd is. It's a gourd that actually has like a neck on it and then kind of a bulb at the end, so it looks like a goose. And he bought a couple of them, brought them back, planted them, and he sold them fresh in the fall. Because people would decorate with gourds in the fall, which is what a lot of people still do today. And he happened to have some that did not sell, so they dried over the winter because he left them out. He's also a carpenter, so he took these dry gourds into his shop in his garage at home and started playing around with them.
I wonder what attracted him in the first place to kind of extrapolate the whole idea of working with a gourd.
Yeah, he is an inventor. His mind does not stop. It's always going. So one time we had a customer come in and they called him a tinkerpreneur because he tinkers until he finds something that works. And so I can remember the very first time we went to shows, one of the first things we made were jack-o'-lantern baskets. And when we first went, we didn't know how to even make them sit, so we put stones in the bottom of them to make them sit. Of course, we have learned a lot since then, so that has not, we no longer have to do that.
Because these things were so light, you had to anchor them down.
Yes, so we figured out a way to sand them and make them sit flat and so forth, but people love them. We are unique because we actually grow, craft, ship. Everything is done here on the farm. And we are also the only company in the world that crafts as their major business.
Now, Dory, try to give us an idea of the scope and the magnitude of the business here. I mean, the room we're in right now, we're surrounded by thousands of gourds, and I have a feeling that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, yeah. We actually have two very large buildings that are outside. They're kind of like a corn crib, but ours is our gourd cribs. And they are from floor to ceiling with bins, this size bins from floor to ceiling, filled with gourds, just sitting there waiting for us to wash them, to craft them, to finish them out, to ship.
And about how long does that take? Once you take a raw gourd off the shelf that's been dried sufficiently, then you got to go to work on it. What kind of tools do you use?
Most of them are woodworking tools like jigsaw, bandsaw, hole saws, drills.
Now it occurs to me walking around your shop, you have all these different shaped gourds. So that's got to bring out a certain inspiration, and whoever's going to decorate that, something must come to mind. It's almost like an ink blot test. You look at a certain shaped gourd and you go, I have a good idea for that gourd.
Yeah, and we have two main designers. Ben, who I told you before is the founder, and his daughter Ashley, who also helps him farm. They are our two main designers. So since they also do the farming, they kind of know what they've grown. So, as they're picking up and they're, pulling things in and looking at the different gourds that actually grew over the last year, they start getting ideas. And I'm not sure quite how they do it all the time because they always have new ideas.
After you cut faces into these gourds and draw other decorations on them, it seems like some of them have a semi-gloss finish on them. So it looks like they're painted with some kind of preservative. Is that just for the appearance, or does that help preserve that decoration?
Some of our gourds, a lot of our gourds are dyed. So if you don't put some kind of a finish on it, every time you touch it, the dye comes off on your fingers. So we do use a satin polyacrylic on most of our gourds so that it seals the dye in, and it also just helps her from scratching it and so forth.
So once the gourd is finished and it has this coating on the outside, is this something I can display in my house indefinitely? I mean, how long does it last? Because again, it occurs to me, going back to our original point, that is a hard-shelled fruit, so this is an organic thing.
It is, and I've had some of my gourds for over 30 years. So we started the business 30 years ago, but Ben actually started playing with these about 2 years before that. So some of my gourds that I have are 30 to 32 years old, and they still look brand new. As long as you store them properly, they will last forever. So it's funny because we have customers now that started with us at the beginning, and then they had children, so they passed them down to their children, and now they're passing them on to their children. So we have two different kind of sets of customers. We have one set who comes just to this room, and in this room is just all the raw gourds, and so anybody who likes to craft gourds will come, they will buy all of this, and they make whatever they want to with it. This, you know, it's endless what they can do. Then we have people who come and they want nothing to do with this area. They're heading strictly to the finished ones. And it all depends on the season as to what they gravitate to. So, you know, like right now, of course, in the wintertime, snowmen are huge. We have littles that we started making about 3 years ago, and they're great because you can use them on Christmas trees or you can sit them around. In the fall, jack-o'-lanterns are real big. You get to spring, and then we have Easter bunnies and chicks. It all really depends on the year, but the more unique the gourd, the more they gravitate to it.
And give us an example. I'm curious now, what might be a more unique gourd? Maybe it's the shape of the gourd. Now, of course, you told us about the goose gourd that really
Right.
does resemble a goose.
Right.
Because it has that long, it's not a stem exactly, it's like an
Right.
extension of the gourd itself.
Exactly. So last year we came out with bats, and people love the bats. This coming year we're going to be doing an elf, and they really gravitate towards the elf. They like the elves. We have deer, we have moose, we have a hippo. We've had elephants before, we have farm animals. So, you know, it is all kind of whatever people like and how their home is decorated.
Now, for the customer that does take a do-it-yourself approach, will they come in this room we're in now and get a raw gourd and they want to make something out of it, do the handcrafting themselves? Do you teach the techniques that might be involved, or maybe recommend some tools?
We can do that. A lot of times if they're already coming into this room, they already know what's going on. But we also have what we call a crafter's corner, and that is where we have kits. So we have everything to do. So all the cutting is done. All they really have to do is paint it, assemble it, and accessorize.
Let's go back to growing these gourds. Dory, what does it take, and do you sometimes have a bad crop for some year? In other words, what's ideal growing conditions for gourds, and how many do you harvest at a time?
We probably grow, I'm gonna say anywhere from like 15 to 30 acres every year, depending on the year and what the year before did.
I wonder how many gourds that translates to.
I have no idea,
Countless
because
thousands.
when you plant one gourd, you're gonna get hundreds on one plant. But if you're looking at some of the bigger gourds,
Larger one, yep.
you may only get like 5 on one plant.
But you like big and small anyway.
Oh yes, so we plant all different types of gourds. There are hundreds of different types. So we grow only what we really use to craft our gourds. We start our gourds in the greenhouse in May. They do not like cold weather at all. So if you try and put them out in cold weather, they will die. We let them grow in May, and then June we actually start planting them outside. Come July, they are in the ground and they've been growing. They're going to start flowering now. We actually have about maybe 6 to 8 high school kids come in, and they actually hand pollinate our gourds. Hand pollinating means going and finding the male flower, taking either a paintbrush or a Q-tip around the stamen of the male flower, and then going, and that one male can do about 2 to 3 female flowers. So then you take that paintbrush or Q-tip and go around they're like little fingers inside the female to pollinate it. You have one chance at this. They open up one time, the flower, and they open up in the evening. So our crew comes in around 4 and does it for a couple hours. Each one of them does about 1,000 flowers a night. So if you don't pollinate that particular flower, it just shrivels up and it dies. What a lot of people don't realize is that gourds are pollinated by moths, which come out in the evening, therefore that's why they open up then. So, but they don't actually get to our area until about August, which makes our growing season a lot shorter, and plus we've missed out on all of the gourds that could have been growing from July to August when the moths actually get here. Once we start seeing the moths, then we stop because they do it much faster than what we do.
See, it didn't occur to me that moths would pollinate gourds.
Yeah, it's a sphinx moth.
Oh, a specific kind of moth.
It's a specific type of moth. And so once they are pollinated, then they grow all summer long. Once the vine dies after the hard frost, the vine dies away, and that is what they're doing right now because we are in November at this point. They cut them off the vine and line them up, and then they stay out there all winter to dry. Then we have those same crew come back in like February, March. And then they start picking them all up, and they are picked up according to size and shape, and then they're sorted and then stored in our big buildings. Yeah, we started out with 5 people. Now we have over 20. We started out with about 20 products. Now we have about 250. So there is a vast amount of knowledge that was gained in those 30 years, how we now put gourds together. You know, we had a lot of times where we tried things and it was like, oh, this is not going to work. You know.
But you have to experiment, right?
We do. In the early years, that's how it was. You kind of tried something. If it worked, great, and if it didn't, then you moved on to the next thing, and that's what it was. But yeah, there's been a lot of changes as to how we do everything, and just put things together, and then just trying to teach somebody, because gourd crafting is not something you normally go to school for.
Tell me about some of the reactions you see on customers' faces, especially the ones that are really discovering the gourd for the first time.
It's really fun to have them. I sit right inside the front door, so I get a lot of, oh my, I didn't know you could do this many things with gourds. Like, you know, they're thinking birdhouses and maybe a jack-o'-lantern or a snowman, but they don't realize the extent of what you can actually do. And that is probably the biggest thing that kind of excites me still, is just watching the people ooh and all over them, or try and figure out where they're going to put them in their house, or, you know, who they're going to buy this gift for. It's just it's a lot of fun to watch.